want a simple world? Follow the simple world. Since December last year, masses of Sudanese people have gathered outside their presidential palace, protesting against the currency devaluation and hiking prices, and protesting against their tough days. After over 4 months of persistence, they finally made a staged breakthrough. Sudan's President Bashir stepped down on April 11th, or to be more exact, the military removed him from power and put him under house arrest in the presidential palace. Perhaps till the moment when Sudan's defense minister announced that Bashir has become a civilian, some of us was aware of this matter or aware of Sudan, this country. Sudanese people have been protesting for months but failed to capture the world's attention. This is what happens when a country has limited international influence. If it cannot associate itself with the internet-famous countries, then even in the information age, their major domestic event is still hard to attract attention from the outside world. Our impression on Africa is poor countries all around the continent, and Sudan is one of them. Sudan is actually pretty well known for its poverty, with the UN's title of one of the least developed countries in the world. Sudan is not only poor but also chaotic, and its domestic situation has been unstable for a long time. It was even once crowned as the world's most unstable country by the Failed States Index. Poverty and chaos often come in bonding, so why exactly is Sudan so poor? 80% of Sudan's population works in agriculture production, and their key crops are cotton, wheat, corn, sorghum, etc. Part of the harvest is consumed by themselves, and any surplus is sold for money. Sudan's industrialization is also in a low level, mostly limited to secondary processing on agriculture products such as cotton fluffing, sugar production, food processing, etc. For an agriculture country with backwards industrial capabilities, becoming rich is really a difficult task. To sum up with the TikTok buzz phrase in China, it is a case of, it's not that I don't want to be rich, but the circumstances just don't allow it. Fortunately, Sudan produces oil, so it is poor but not the poorest in Africa. But oil exports have not been satisfactory. With Sudan splitting into 2 countries in 2011, one is the current Sudan, the other is South Sudan. South Sudan took nearly 60% of its oil fields when they split up, which means that the revenues of Sudan has been dwindling since 2011. It is a poor country as it is, and what's even worse is its income has been dwindling, which led the problems caused by money are destined to get more and more. From bad to worse, ever since 2011, the decline in international oil prices has left one of the most profitable industries unreliable. Less money leads to less commodities, and then the price will go up, which led people's life tougher. What used to be tolerable is now intolerable. So, at the end of 2018, the conflict intensified completely. People besieged their presidential palace. Mr. Bashir, who has been the president for 30 years, had to be the scapegoat and was forced to step down after struggling for over 4 months. Bashir had probably only a high school education, but he did very well in the army, starting with a paratrooper and climbing all the way up to the position of general. At the age of 45, he staged a military coup and dissolved the parliament cabinet and all the local governments, climbed down all the political parties, and took over all the media. Then he became the supreme ruler and kept his ruling till today. Bashir has been in power for 30 years, during which there has been numerous changes to the government of Sudan. But no matter how the government changes, the most powerful position has always been held by Bashir. Whenever a 5-year term ended, he always managed to be re-elected. Bashir had planned to run for the next term in 2020. However, he could not hold on till that day. Probably he would never have the chance again in the rest of his life. During the 4 months when the crowd was protesting in front of his office, Bashir and his team have been thinking of solutions. Usually, there are 3 options for an emergency like this. The first one is to order the military to drive away the protesters, so he could still be the president. Bashir has done this, but the result was not good. The second one is to resign and hand over his position to the vice president, awaiting the next election. The third one is to ask the military to take over when he is about to lose control of the situation. Bashir chose the third option in the end. The military surrounded the presidential palace, and then the defense minister announced that Bashir had been deposed and he would be the acting president. The reason why Bashir chose the third option was because he had a good relationship with the military. The power was not seized by the oppositions after all, and his safety and well-being of his men were still guaranteed. When the crowd heard the president was deposed, they celebrated with cheers, since this was the result they had waited for 4 months. However, when Ibn, the defense minister, finished his announcement, the cheers suddenly disappeared. The saying and dancing people all stopped, leaving a dead silence. Ibn's announcement was like this: the military has decided to dismiss the government and suspend the constitution. The country will enter a state of emergency with a curfew enforced, a transitional military council will be formed, and I will be the head of the council. Bashir came to power as a defense minister during a coup. The old trick played again by incumbent Sudan's defense minister Ibn. Why not have Bashir doing this, since he has rather rich experience on this job? Consequently, the Sudanese celebrating the victory quickly turned to chanting against Ibn, against military seizure of power. Facing such enormous pressure, Ibn had to step down from his new position the next day, and only held the supreme power for a few hours. There is a political committee as part of the Transitional Military Council. The head of the committee tried to smooth things over, suggesting they shall reconsider it and for now just make do with the civilian government. Afterwards, the military council will be only in charge of security, excluding the civilian government's work. The proposal slightly set Sudanese mind at ease. That's pretty much how the Sudan story goes. If Sudan manages to recover usual tranquility, a long time span may be needed, which depends on the efficiency for the authority to redistribute power and benefits. Whenever there are political fights within a country, people are used to listening about experts talking about system, right, liberty, etc., and deem those as the root of problems. Yet, from citizens' perspective, the root all lies in economy. If Sudan's economic level doubled, Bashir may remain as the president next year. But if the economy quadrupled, the Sudanese people will worship Bashir like king. It is somewhat like many of our ordinary families. The core issue making the wife's teary and the husband silent is usually money. If the family income doubled or even quadrupled, many problems would disappear immediately. The wife would no longer object her husband boring or his addiction to games. The husband also would not complain the spendthrift wife and her bad temper. Economic base is the foundation of many things. That is to say, money is really important. So we can say as long as the economy keeps developing well in a country, then its domestic policies will go stable? Of course not. In the past weekend, the Yellow Vest movement was still staged on time in France. The romantic French people chanted slogans and threw bottles on the streets. They had played this outdoor activity for half a year. The French are far from poor. However, the situation in France is still unstable. From the Sudanese point of view, the French is hypocritical in some extent. Therefore, some countries can maintain social stability when their people get rich, and other countries have little to do with incomes. It's like some families would become harmonious when they had more money, but other families' problems have little to do with the money, as they may not lack of money. So the level of economic development is crucial in some countries, but not in others. The reasons have already been taught to us in the politics textbooks of middle school. Both Marx and those former leaders who left behind their respective theories of governance all tirelessly talk about grasping society's major contradictions and dealt with it. When the country is relatively poor as a whole, or changes from the external environment lead to a severe downturn, the main contradiction will have something to do with money, such as today's protagonist Sudan. When a country has a high-level economy but people are still wrangling on the streets, the main contradictions may be something else, such as France. So what is our principal contradictions? In the past, regardless of having the entrance examination of undergraduate and postgraduate, a very familiar sentence always appeared on the political paper. The social contradiction at the present stage is the one between people's increasing material needs and the backward productive forces. That makes sense. People want a good life, but it can be met in a short time. Here is a contradiction. So how is this main contradiction resolved? The answer appears more than once on paper too. That is continuing to take economic development as the center task. Investing domestically and exporting overseas, firstly make people's life better. As long as the growing material needs are kept being met, then the contradictions would not be accumulated to the extent of besieging the presidential palace. Of course, the previous major contradiction almost has been solved. The main contradiction that appears on the future examination papers will be this sentence: the contradiction between the people's growing needs for a better life and unbalanced inadequate development. The contradiction used to be the lack of stuff, therefore owning was enough for us. But now we're short of nothing but for those qualified stuff. So our economic policies will be adjusted towards satisfying the demand of a great life. Perhaps it is appropriate to assign our previous primary contradictions to Sudan. Their problem is people's material needs cannot be met, so they are to protest outside the presidential palace. To talk with them about democracy, rights, or responsibilities at this point, that doesn't make sense. No matter it is current transitional government or a new government in the future, if they can't concentrate on developing their economy, then sooner or later, the ruler will be criticized and forced to step down by the public, which will probably recur once it happens. When we observe the international affairs, if we can reflect on ourselves, then that may be our biggest gain. For an ordinary family, if the mortgage has not been paid off or basic requirements of life can hardly to be satisfied, then income issue should be the biggest challenge of the family. Imaginary and romantic indulgence must not be paid too much attention, which will be subject to dislike the contempt. In this case, those who are able to earn money are handsome or beautiful. But it is far from enough to merely find the primary contradiction. The process is incomplete until the problem is solved. For certain problems, the hardest part is to find the root, and it is relatively easy to solve them. However, economic problems are just the opposite. It is very simple to realize the shortage of money, but making money and getting rich is very difficult, which always perplexes people. Perhaps the president or the king of every poor country in Africa is well aware that the problems they are facing will be resolved as long as the economy is doing well, but they are really incapable of developing the economy, not even being taught by others. Reading this, we ought to give a thumb up to those who know well the way to make money, as well as those countries that have successfully developed their economy.
Thanks for watching. Share if you like us. See you next time.